Thank you, Marlon. My name is Nameet, in case you don't know who I am, and I get the privilege of serving here at Bethlehem as the young adult pastor. Pastor Steve today, our lead pastor, is on a much-needed vacation, getting some much-needed rest, and can we just thank Pastor Steve for his work, his dedication, his love for this church. There are only a few places that Pastor Steve would rather be on a Sunday, and he doesn't even make it a habit of being those places often because he loves our church and guides it so well. Today I get the privilege of being able to lead us through the Word, and I'm incredibly excited, but before we do that, I just want to say I don't take these moments lightly. I know the kind of trust and respect that is needed. I know the kind of integrity and responsibility that is necessary for doing this kind of stuff, and often I wonder, why me? But this is something that I don't take lightly, and I'm incredibly grateful to our senior pastor for these opportunities to do so, and the trust and the respect that he has for me, the love that he has for our church, but also the way that he believes in young leaders and young leadership. From the first few moments that I began coming to this church, I would hear about how much he loved young leaders and young leadership and believes in the next generation, and that has only proven to be truer and truer, and he's become more and more invested in the lives of my generation, the generation I represent, and the generation that is under me. And so he's just a fantastic leader, and I'm grateful to be here with you. This morning, we're going to continue the series that we've been on the topic of miracles, and if I needed to title my message today, it would be called The Miracle That Got Jesus in Trouble. So we've talked about a lot of Jesus' work and the reason for which he did miracles and the outcomes of those miracles, and today we're going to come across a miracle together where the result of it is Jesus getting in trouble, and we're going to ask a couple of questions and see what the Lord has for us today. So before we get into the scripture, actually, I want to read you a story. And sometimes I think the best way to immerse ourselves in a story is not by looking, but by hearing. And so if you want to close your eyes through the duration of the story, go ahead so that you can imagine it a little bit more. If my voice is boring enough or the story is boring enough and you're going to fall asleep, don't close your eyes. But this is what we're going to do, all right? Let's get started. Do you have a clue of what it means to be an invalid? To be disabled, lacking the capacity for the physical movement that living demands of us? How can one have hope without the ability to realize the goal of that hope? Is that what faith is? Hope for the hopeless? For 38 years, I have lain here beside a pool, a public bath, in a place called Bethesda, the house of mercy, waiting to be first. There's a legend running back to the time of the captivities, maybe even before, that an angel would come down and swirl the waters, and the first one in the pool, when that happens, would be healed. Well, that's the story anyway. It gave my family enough reason to bring me here when they decided that they couldn't or didn't want to take care of me at home. Even those who should love us by all reasonable expectations have a hard time staying with us when we have problems they can't fix. We humiliate them by showing them their limitations. We terrify them by reminding them of their own fragility, and we disgust them because care for us necessarily involves the repulsive sights and smells of a broken and weak body. Survival for the broken and powerless means learning the desperate substitute for love manipulation. To get by longer than anyone else here, I've had to learn how to successfully whine and beg others to help me despite their disgust. I've had to borrow the life of others in order to live. My only hope for getting out here is this pool, and that's no hope at all. I've tried to crawl to what they call the stirring many times, but the blind and the lame push ahead of me, and I've got no one to carry me and put me in the water. Is the legend even true? I wonder if it's just all in my head, yet I still remain. Today is Sabbath, which means I'm hungry. No one is going to bring me a piece of bread or a cup of water, not with these Pharisees around on the lookout for Sabbath breakers. Yet the pool is a gathering place, even on the Sabbath. Visitors enjoy the shade of the colonnades as they talk. I lie on my mat listen and watch what I can. Useless legs mean I only see from one point of view. I hear a new group walking by. They're a mix of teachers, religious scholars, and Pharisees who are discussing points of the law. Discussing is hardly the word for what they're doing. They're arguing, while us people, starving for God, are left hungry for more. What can their religion do for my pain? That's what I'd like to know. It's like salt on the sores that I get lying here, having to listen to them go on like this. A young rabbi stops suddenly by my mat and smiles at me. This isn't the cold-eyed sneer that I usually get from those who won't even come close enough to get their robes dirty. No, he's giving me an honest grin of greeting, and his eyes are warm. When he speaks, his words are tough. How long have you been here? He asks me. 38 years, teacher. The quizzical look on his face tells me what he thinks about the legend to which I have pinned all of my hopes. Do you want to be made well? I flush with quick anger at the question. What does he mean, do I want to be made well? Why? If he knew everything I go through every single day to live, how can he ask such a thing of a destitute paralytic who obviously needs help? It's not my fault I can't make it into the water. If I could get to the pool, does he really think that I would still be here? Besides, this is what I know. This is all I know. This is my life. I get by here. I have no other place to go. Do I want to be made well? What do you think? Instead, why don't you tell me how you're going to help me get into the pool? That's what I think anyway, but I don't answer like that. I try to deflect this question with pity and self-blame. Sir, I have no one to put me in the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I'm making my way, somebody steps down ahead of me. He looks at me as if he can see right through me, all my pain and bitterness and defensiveness. I know that he can tell that I have no choice but disappointment, that my hope to be healed in the pool is foolish. I can also tell that he doesn't care about any of this. He sees me just as I am, a wreck of a man, and he doesn't flinch away in disgust. Instead, his words cut away my shame like a surgeon cuts away diseased tissue with a knife. Pick up your mat and walk. That's it. That's all he says to me, but as soon as he speaks the words, I know he has given me the power to stand up, and I do. I reach down without stiffness or difficulty. I fold my mat, walk back and forth, every step a gift of strength and health. But there are disconcerted looks on the faces of the religious crowd that part silently before me. I'm so happy that it doesn't matter why they're upset. When I turn to thank the man, he's gone. I have a sudden yearning to go outside in the sunshine. I tuck the mat, my one earthly possession, under my arm, and I head in the direction of the temple to give thanks. That pool had been my obsession for 38 years. Now my last view of it is my reflection as I walk past with a grin. A line of frowning, cross-armed priests, scholars, and Pharisees block the gate in front of me. I can see that they don't intend for me to pass. They cannot contain their indignation and shout at me, "It's the Sabbath. It's not lawful for you to pick up your mat and carry it." Unbelievable. I lay here at the pool for all these years as a half man, and none of them even gave me a word. They never paid attention to me until this moment, and they don't recognize me, but I know them. They spend so much time looking for the wrong that they easily miss what's right. Could I be healed on the Sabbath except by a miracle of God? But these joy killers would rather that I remain sick and paralyzed than walk out whole and happy into the light. They didn't give me my joy, and they can't take it from me. I look them straight in the eyes, another new experience for me, and I tell them the truth, that all of their rules can't stop. The man who made me well said to me, "Pick up your mat and walk." They snap back at me with the unanimity of suspicion. "Who is the man who told you, pick up your mat and walk?" I look back in the crowd. Now moving around me to witness the confrontation. The man is nowhere to be seen. They keep hissing the question at me, and I don't have an answer. "I don't know who he is," I finally replied. My inquisitors arch their eyebrows and nod at each other. For a moment, I feel like crawling back in my mat in shame. But I'm standing, and I can walk, and that can't be denied of me. I take courage in that thought. The religious enforcers have made their point and they turn away from me, and I walk on and head for the temple. See, there in the outer court, my healer comes to me with a smile. I'm glad I found you, my friend. My name is Jesus. See, you have been healed, and it's a permanent healing. But don't go at it alone with God again, because worse things will happen to you. I'm so excited to find out who healed me that I tell everyone hearing in the distance, this is Jesus. Praise God, Jesus is the one who made me well today at the pool of Bethesda. Some of the same religious scholars and Pharisees who had demanded to know who told me to pick up my mat and walk are in the crowd. They move in and wag their fingers at Jesus. They snarl, Sabbath breaker, how dare you violate the holy commandment? But Jesus is unfazed. He faces them and says, my Father is working, and I am working still. He leaves no doubt that the Father Jesus is talking about is God, which would make Jesus the Son of God if he's telling the truth. Could he be the Messiah? That would explain my healing. No matter for now, because the crowd has quickly turned ugly and they're seething with rage. Blasphemer, they shout. He dares make himself equal to God? I've had a lot of time to interpret men's eyes, and what I am seeing now is the intent to kill. They want to murder the man who healed me. That story was written by Kent Hansen, who is an attorney by trade and a writer and an author and speaker. And he writes for an article website in which you see spiritual realities in the day-to-day things. Being imaginative is not bad when you've got something more than just imagination to build on. And sometimes the best spiritual realities happen when we use our imagination. And so now that we've gotten ourselves a little bit more into the story, let's read the story for ourselves and see what the Lord has prepared for us today. If you have your Bibles, please turn with me to John chapter 5. And we're going to read from verses 1 through 17. And again, the title of my message today is The Miracle That Got Jesus in Trouble. Starting at verse 1, here's what he says. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool. In Aramaic, it's called Bethesda, which has 5 roof colonnades, and in these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there a long time, he said to him, do you want to be healed? The man answered him, Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. And while I am going, another steps down before me. Jesus said to him, Get up, take up your bed, and walk. At once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked. Now that day was the Sabbath, so Jesus said to the man who had been healed, It is the Sabbath. It is not lawful for you to take up your bed. But he answered, The man who healed me said to me, Take up your bed and walk. They asked him, Who is the man that said that to you? Take up your bed and walk. Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, and there was a crowd in the place. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, See, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you. The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed them. And this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, My Father is working until now, and I am working. Lord, we thank you this morning for the power of your word. God, we thank you for the goodness of your character, your merciful nature, God, that would give us your scripture so that we might come to know you. And so, Lord, I ask, God, that despite me, you would use the words and the truth that is in this text as arrows, God, that you would launch them back and you would fire them into our hearts so that we might be pierced in such a way that we would see you, be transformed by you. God, we ask you to do the thing that only you can do. Would you do something beyond physical ability? Would you do something beyond human reasoning? Would you do something beyond just mere affections and stirring of hearts, God, but would you do something utterly supernatural in our lives today? We thank you and we pray this in your name. Amen. So the miracle that got Jesus in trouble. What we're going to do this morning is we're going to walk through this story, not verse by verse, because, well, we could be here for a couple of days, especially if I'm the one talking. But we're going to go through a couple of verses and see what we can pick apart and what is there and how that might help us, how that might change us, and give us a better understanding of God. Verse 2 says, "Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool in Aramaic called Bethesda." The setting here is really important for two reasons. One, the sheep gate was located near the temple in Jerusalem, and that's where all of the animals that would be prepared for sacrifice were. Now, the sacrificial system during that time was a temporary grace and a temporary mercy system. It wasn't meant to last forever, but it was to show the people of God that there are real consequences to your sin. That in order for you to be forgiven, it comes at a cost. In order for you to receive mercy, it comes at a cost. And every animal that would be slain and sacrificed would be a reminder to the people, your sin results in death. But the grace is that something has died in your place. So that's what the sheep gate signified. Now, near that sheep gate was this pool called Bethesda, which is translated to the house of mercy. And John lets us know that this house of mercy, that this pool, attracted the kinds of people that needed mercy because they were experiencing much, much, much affliction. In verse 3, John tells us, "In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed." Some of your translations might use the word withered. Others would say withered hands. And the whole idea is, on a literal basis, right, what John is just saying on the surface is that there are people there that can't see. There are people there that can't walk. They can't move. They can't use their legs. And then the paralyzed and the withered, I don't think John is saying, I don't think he's repeating that they can't walk. I actually think he's talking about their hands. And some commentators would say that these are people who had withered hands, and so they couldn't produce anything. They couldn't do anything with their hands. They couldn't make a living for themselves, so they were reduced to begging. Sometimes I think physical realities describe spiritual realities. And we can see that in this story, and I think there's a reason why John had put this group of people there. The blind, the unable to stand, and the unable to produce. I remember there was some time ago, I was out visiting my parents who live about an hour away. And on the way home, I needed to stop for gas before I jumped on the highway. And I was with my son, and he was maybe about 6 months old now, just he and I. And I stop in the gas station, and I'm pumping gas, and somebody starts walking to me, and I made the ever so mistake of making eye contact. Now, some people find talking to strangers as an opportunity. I'll be honest, I find that as an inconvenience. I'm like, hey, it's been a long day, it's hot, I had to just spend so much money on gas, I just want to get in my car, I want to go home, like my son is crying, when you're fixed on doing something, all you want to do is that one thing, and you just want to go. But this man approaches me, I make eye contact with him, I feel convicted about going, this man's a bother, but that's for another time. And so he comes up to me and he goes, hey, do you have any money? And I was like, of course, yes, absolutely. This would happen right now. And so I said, what's going on? And he's like, listen, man, and he gives me his whole spiel. I'm homeless, and I got no place to go, or I got no place to stay. I live in a tent in the woods. And I'm like, what woods? But whatever. And so he's telling me about his life, and he's telling me the miserable state that he's in. And I was like, hey, listen, if you're hungry, my mom packed me a whole bunch of food, right? Because mothers cook as if you're dying all the time. And so I was like, my mom gave me enough food to feed all of India. Like, we're good. Like, just come and you can have that. And he goes, no, man, that's your food. Like, it's okay. Just a couple of bucks will be fine. I'm like, yeah, it's my food. I can give my food to whoever I want. Why don't you take some food? And he goes, no. And I'm like, all right, then you're not really hungry. Like, you just want my money. And I was like, so do you just want my money? And he goes, yes. And I was like, okay. So I finished pumping, and I was like, hey, let me check in the glove compartment, because I usually keep a couple of bucks there anyway. And so I was like, let me grab some money and see what I can do for you. And he says, all right. So as I'm walking from the back of my car to the front, I sit down and I grab the cash. I just felt the Holy Spirit say to me, give the man what money can't buy. And I said, of course you would ask me to do this. Okay. So I get back out, I walk over, the money is in my hand, and I show it to him, and I said, hey, listen, what do you believe? And he just immediately got annoyed. He can see the thing he wants and goes, I believe the same thing you do. And I was like, then what do I believe? And he goes, Jesus? And I was like, actually, yeah, I do. And he has this sigh of relief, and he goes, okay. And then I said, so what is he like? And he goes, man, Jesus does good, and if you do good to me, he'll do good to you. And I was like, wrong person to talk to about this. And I said, hey, do you have a Bible? And he goes, yeah, I read it all the time. What was the last thing you read? The book of Gideon, he says. And I was like, hey man, there is no book of Gideon in our Bible. And he was like, come on, man. And at that very moment, I said, hey, I think what you're doing, wandering, not having a place to call your own, scraping for whatever you can, everything you're doing physically, I feel like that's what your soul is like too. Your soul is wandering, it has no place to call its home. Do you know what home is? You're scraping for things that will momentarily satisfy, but it's not going to lead to something long-term, right? We ended up having a great conversation after that. He got so undefensive and he got so less threatening to me. And kid you not, I mean, it was honestly just the boldness of the Lord, because that's just not me. Like, I don't do that kind of stuff. And we ended up talking for a great amount of time, and I got to share the full story of Jesus with him, and I could tell he needed something more than what money could give him. And I gave him the money, by the way. I eased his temporary relief as well. I gave him some temporary relief as well. But sometimes physical realities can determine or can show us what's going on spiritually as well. And I think John is trying to get us to see that when he tells us these are the kind of people that are here at the place of mercy, looking for something. He says that they're blind, he says that they're lame, and he says that they're withered. Now, commentators would say that this is a depiction of God's people at the time, that this is a depiction of the nation of Israel. They're blind, they can't see. Here's why. They have the Messiah right in front of him, doing all of the Messiah things that the Old Testament would prophesy that he would come and he would do. And they look right past it, and they can't see him. Not only that, but the religious leaders at the time, the ones who are supposed to be the pinnacle of God's commandments and what we ought to be doing, are failing at obeying God's commandments, so they're not even walking with God in the very commandments that they boast about. And then lastly, all of their work, all of their producing for God amounts to nothing because it's not pleasing to him to begin with. They don't see God, they're not walking with God, they're not producing anything for God, and there's a rhythm that John is trying to get us to understand. If you want to do something for God, you have to walk with him. If you want to walk with God, you have to see him. Have you seen him? Have you seen his face before you? Or are you just flirting with religious doctrines and religious ideas and church attendance? Have you seen him? If you've seen him, are you walking with him? Jesus only stays still for a small amount of time. He's going. Are you walking with him? And if you've seen him and you're walking with him, what are you doing for him? Right? There are many that want to do for the Lord but don't walk with him. There are many that say that they're walking with the Lord, but they don't see him. There's a rhythm that John is trying to get the people of God to understand. But not only that, I think this is a cultural commentary for us today as well. Because we can look back and say, yeah, they were blind. They couldn't see. They couldn't see what was going on. They couldn't stand. Right? They had no ability to make some motion in the ways that they were supposed to. They weren't producing anything. Thank God we've got it right. Thank God we've gotten it so much better. Well, I might make some enemies by what I'm about to say, but I don't think we as a culture can see any clearer than they did. I don't think we as a culture are standing any stronger than they were, and I don't think we as a culture are producing anything remotely close to what they were as well. Today we live in a day of subjectivity, in a day of relativism. Things are relative to us. We also live in a day and age, particularly my generation, the one I represent, and the generation younger than me. We're brought up in a very unassuming kind of skepticism in which we can justifiably be skeptical of anything and everything. Whether good or bad, be skeptical about it. Try to do your best to see right through it and question all of it. Here's the problem with our hyperskepticism. We need a grounding for our skepticism in order for skepticism to work. So we can't be so overly skeptical that nothing is true and nothing makes sense, because in that very notion, with that very idea, how are we being skeptical in the first place? Why should we even trust our skepticism if everything is subject to skepticism? C.S. Lewis was brilliant enough to see right through it. He says, "You can't go on seeing through things forever. The whole point of seeing through something is to see something through it. To see through all things is the same as not to see." This is the kind of conversation that you'd be likely to have today with most people. If you were to ask them, hey, describe something good. Describe a good thing. Think about it for a second, and they'd probably give an answer like, oh, like this thing is good, that's a good action. This is a good thing, that's a good person. And then you would ask, what makes it so? What makes it good? What makes that a desirable thing? What makes that thing better than other things of the same kind and of the same category? And after some thinking and maybe some flexing of brain muscles that would happen, you would 9 times out of 10 get to this kind of answer, well, it's good because I think it's good. According to me, this is a good thing. And then comes a question that might be a little bit troubling, and if you were to say, well, what if I don't? What if I don't think that thing you think is good? What if I call it bad? Can we both be right? You would ask. And again, 9 times out of 10, you'll hear this answer. Sure we can. Because things are a matter of perspective. Things are a matter of how we interact with them. Things are a matter of our experience with something. Not the thing itself, but how I perceive it, how I relate to it. So something could be good for me, and it could be bad for you, and we could be perfectly fine. Do you see the problem with that? Because if things can be like that, then we're not really talking about anything. If things can change the moment we start thinking differently about them, if we can change things entirely, because after all, truth only exists in our heads, not only do we not see, but we have no equal footing to talk about anything, because everything becomes nothing. Think of this example. This might be helpful. Let's say you take your kid to the park. And as you walk through the gate of the park, you're with your child, and somebody walks up and grabs your child by the hand and says, "This is my kid now." And you go, "You're trying to die today. Like you woke up with the intention of dying, calling my kid yours." And after being confused for a minute and maybe exercising a little bit of self-control, you go, "No, they're not. This is my child." And you go, "I brought this child here physically I have the medical records to support that. I can do a biological test to support. So I've got science on my side. I've also got pictures and videos of this child with me growing up, all of that kind of stuff. So I've got photographic proof of it as well. I've got a whole host of witnesses, family members that can tell you, this is my child. And the person could justifiably look at you and go, yeah, you might interpret all of that information and all of that evidence as this is your kid. But to me, that's all not true. This is my child. Or let's say somebody goes to your house and decides, this is my house now. Right? Imagine you just go to church, you have a nice little lunch and dinner with your family, and then you go home and you just see a family sitting there, and you're like, why? Right? Typically the question that goes to my mind is why? This is our house now. To you, this was your home, but to us, this is our home. I mean, you can do that with your phone too. Somebody just takes your phone and says, this is mine now. It's like the fingerprint won't even work with your hand. No. Just a matter of interpretation. Do I think those things will happen? I really hope not. But the problem is, what stops it from happening? You see, it costs nothing to bid on something. But once you win the auction, you have to pay the cost. Our culture has no issue bidding on self-truth, subjectivism. Things are what I make them to be until we have to pay a dear price for them. Is the universe what we make of it? Is reality invented? Do we create it? Or is it discovered? Do we stumble upon something outside of us that's there? Is there a real right or a real wrong out there? And if there isn't anything that simply is, right, the fancy theological term for being is ontology. If there's nothing outside of us that simply is, then we really run fool's errands by talking about anything. And if things are just in our heads, why do we trust reason to begin with? Why does reason work if I can change anything that I want? How would I even know that it's changing if reason wasn't fixed and it wasn't predictable and there wasn't a law that governed it, right? It doesn't make sense. But again, we can bid on things as a culture, but when we finally have to pay the price, no one's willing to pay because we know that it doesn't work. This is the danger that our culture faces. And this is the danger that particularly I'm speaking to my generation and those of you that are a little bit younger than me. We unassumedly are brought up in this, and we think it's okay to think like this, but it's not. There has to be something outside of us in order for anything to make sense. We don't see, we don't stand, and lastly, we don't produce. And you might say, what are you talking about? We're such an industrious group of people. We're so savvy. We're able to make so many things. We are, and we do for ourselves. Because as a culture, we've normalized selfishness in a very subtle way. And here's the idea. Live for yourself and give everybody else the scraps. Because we don't do things because they're good to do. We don't do things because they're right to do. We don't do things because they're virtuous and noble. That's not enough anymore to do something. We do things because we feel like doing them. And again, there's a danger with that way of thinking, because what if one day I woke up and felt like I want multiple wives today? Or I just want to decrease the amount of children that I'm responsible for. Is sacrifice a matter of feeling like doing it? Or do we do it because it's the right thing to do, irregardless of whether we feel like doing it when we step up to the plate? Our culture has subtly normalized selfishness. Moving along to verse 6. I promise the rest of this will be a lot shorter, but this was some of the big stuff too, to work through. I figured let's chew the big stuff now and then sample the other stuff later. This is what it says in verse 6. When Jesus saw him laying there, he knew that he had already been there a long time, and he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" Jesus asks a question. And you got to wonder why. It seems a little silly, right? Jesus asking a question to a man who very evidently needs a healing. He would only be at the pool if he could get healed. And so why is Jesus asking the question? Some people would say that it's to test the man. Really push whether the guy was sincere enough that he wanted a healing. Because after all, being a beggar in the first century at least meant you were getting something, right? Who cares if it was on pity? You're not really living a self-respectful life being a beggar anyway, so you might as well rake in what you can. There are people nowadays that make a living off of begging, and maybe part of that could also be, it's just what he knows. For 38 years, frustration and hope can turn into disappointment, which can just turn into acceptance. This is what it is. This is my life, and I can't change anything about it. And I might try a little bit, but I've just accepted the fact. At least this is what I know. And we can be like that too, right? Taking pride in our afflictions, just feeling like I've been through worse than anyone else here. And in some sense, that's I'm better than them. In some sense, I feel superior to them. Look at all these people in their comfortable cars and their nice houses and their inability to have to struggle through everything. If they had known what I've been through, man, right? We think at least it gives us enough self-respect to stand. We're in no better place than other people, but at the very least, we have our experiences. Can we boast in our afflictions? I think so. Can we benefit from our infirmities? Absolutely. Especially as a day and age in a culture that we live in where we celebrate victims. Think about that for a moment. Before the first century, if you were weak, if you could be prey, you would be prey. Nobody celebrated weak people. People had pity on weak people, or people would exploit weak people. And there's an author, his name is Tom Holland, not Spider-Man. Okay, this always happens. I'll talk about this guy, Tom Holland, and they're like, I didn't know he wrote books. I'm like, I'm not talking about Peter Parker. Tom Holland is a historian, and he maps out, he's also not a Christian, but he maps out moral values from the first century, and he wrote a book called Dominion. And the book was called How the Values of Christ, or the book was about how the values of Christ shaped and changed the modern world and the Western world as we know it. Because think about it like this. The only way we can celebrate and care for and pay attention to victims is if we thought there was something valuable about them beyond their physical abilities and beyond their capabilities and what they were producing. Where do we get that from? And you might say it's just human decency. Not according to the first century, not according to the Greco-Roman world, not according to other civilizations. When they saw weak people, they saw opportunity to exploit. But when we see people who are suffering, when we see people who are afflicted, we think back to love thy neighbor. We think back to mercy. We think back to grace. We think back to this common moral law and go, we got to do something about this. Only through Christianity can we get a kind of idea about caring for victims in the first place. But we as a culture have exploited that and have gone, let's celebrate victims and let's even champion victims for their victimhood until they start to get annoying, and then we blame them for their victimhood, right? I don't think Jesus asked the man the question to test him. I think he asked the man the question to fill him with hope. Once again, he is asked, do you want to be made well? And the man, I'm sure, thinks about all of the ways that he could be made well, but he hasn't. I'm sure he thinks about his 38-year life plan and goes, it's amounted to nothing. Yes, I want to be made well. I think Billy Graham said it best. He said, the end of man is the beginning of God. And it's important for us to get to that kind of place where we recognize, I contribute nothing to this. If it's not all God, then it's not God at all. We need to get to the end of ourselves, and I think this is what the question serves to do. The sick man answers him, Sir, I have no one to put me in the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I am going down, another steps in front of me. For 38 years, the man has had his eyes fixed on this physical place, this physical object, this destination, and says, if I could only get to the pool, I would be good. And now he has the healer in front of him, not only the one who could heal his body, but the one who, just like we sang this morning, that by him and through him all things were made. He has the man that can heal him, but he sees right through the guy. He sees right through Jesus and looks at the pool and says, if I can only get there. He's attached his hopes, his dreams, his desires, his future, his opportunity. His idea of the good life is, if I could get to the pool, I'll be good. Doesn't that sound familiar? How often do we think, man, that next thing, that next place, that next relationship, that next change I do to my body, that'll be it. That next job, that'll be it. That next car, that'll be it. That next house, that'll be it. My kids are a failure, so my grandchildren, that'll be it, right? We all have things, created things that we can attach our hopes and our values and our dreams to. And just like this man, for 38 years, the pool is wet, but the man is completely dry. That's how these things keep us. It looks enticing, it looks beautiful, it looks great, and they could be good things, right? Family, security, jobs, those are fantastic things. We should be doing those things with integrity, but when those things become the source of our hope, our value, our desires, our opportunity, our feeling good about ourselves, some of us are only as good as our jobs. Some of us are only as good as the way our families look. Some of us are only as good as the way we look. Some of us are only as good as our morality. We can't handle failure. We can't handle loss. We can't handle an ugly day. We can't handle people not liking us. We've attached our hopes and values to all kinds of things. We look right through Jesus and we see the pool. We're no different than the man. At least I'm not. Jesus could be standing right in front of us, offering us something so much better, so much more permanent, and yet our eyes are fixed on, Jesus, help me get that other thing. Jesus will always stand between you and the thing you think you need. That's not him. And here's why. Because Jesus doesn't exist to make our dreams come true. The life he offers is not an addition to our lives. It's a new life entirely, with new dreams, new hopes, new convictions, and new desires. You see, before Jesus, our life orbits around us. After meeting Jesus and realizing that his life is so much more worthy of ours than our own, our life begins to orbit around him. C.S. Lewis puts it really well. Here's what he says. Imagine yourself as a living house. God comes in to rebuild that house. At first, perhaps, you can understand what he's doing. He's getting the drains right, he's stopping the leaks in the roof, and so on. You knew these jobs needed doing, and so you're not surprised. But presently, he starts knocking the house about in a way that hurts abominably. And he does not seem to be making any sense. What on earth is he up to? The explanation is that he is building quite a different house from the one you thought of. Throwing out a new wing here, putting up an extra floor there, running up towers, making courtyards. You thought you were being made into a decent little cottage, but he is building a palace and intends to come and live in it himself. Moving along, verse 8, after the response that the man gives, Jesus said to him, "Get up and take your bed and walk." And at once the man was healed and took up his bed and walked, and now the day was the Sabbath. Now we see the strength to obey. If God commands you to do something, he'll give you the strength to do it. It's not a matter of God's willingness. I think it's more of a matter of, do we believe in his authority? If God has said to do something through his word, will he not also give us the strength to do it? He tells the man, go and do the thing you were not able to do for 38 years. If I were to tell somebody that, I don't think I would get very much success. But then again, I'm not the one who spoke to Saturn and said, Saturn, you go over there. Mars, you stay over here. All of you planets orbit in this gravitational constant. Stars, you stay here. Jesus speaks galaxies and they obey. He speaks to galaxies and they obey. He speaks to planets and they obey. And then he speaks to the man's bones and his flesh. And they also obey. But the man also needs to obey. right? We have choice. So do we submit to the authority of God when he tells us to do something, or do we not? So the Jews said to the man, now this is jumping down to verse 10. And when I say Jews, I don't mean an encapsulation of all people in Jerusalem, all Jewish people. This specifically means to the religious leadership. The Jews said to the man who had been healed, it is the Sabbath. It's not lawful for you to take up your bed. Now we see the offense. We see the real problem unfolding right before our very eyes. You know, generally, we're often bothered by things most when they happen to us, right? In general, we can say that carjacking is bad, but we're really, really upset when carjacking happens to us, right? We're like, this town needs a law against carjacking, and we need more security and all this kind of stuff happening. Same thing with wallets, right? It's wrong to steal somebody else's wallet. It's really wrong to steal my wallet, right? We're most bothered by things when they affect us, when they're touching the things that we care about. The Jewish leadership is not bothered by the man being healed. They actually can't even see it as a good thing. They see it as a problem because his healing happened on the Sabbath and the man is carrying his mat. In their interpretation of the law, he's doing work. You don't work on the Sabbath. They're violating one of their laws. And here's what really they're doing. In Jeremiah 17:22, it says, don't carry a burden. And so the Jewish leadership took that to mean, do not do any physical work on the Sabbath. It's not the same thing. Carrying a burden for the sake of doing work to benefit yourself, that's forbidden. But doing physical work, especially if it means helping another person, especially if it means establishing good and doing good to other people, but they take the law to mean don't do any kind of physical work whatsoever. This man breaks their interpretation of the law, which is the oral tradition. When you read the New Testament and Jesus says, you have heard it said, he's usually speaking to the oral tradition of the Jewish leadership, but he did not break the law itself. Here's why that's really important. Some people would look at that and say, Jesus commanded this man to sin, and therefore Jesus is sinless, and therefore Jesus can't be trusted, and therefore he can't be our Messiah. That's not what's happening. He's not breaking the law, he's breaking the interpretation, the oral tradition that the Jewish leadership had. Here's why it's a problem. Jesus has come to expose the wickedness and the blindness of the Jewish leadership at the time. This is what John writes just a couple of chapters before. And this is the judgment. The light has come into the world, and people loved the darkness rather than the light because their works were evil. For everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his works should be exposed. But whoever does what is true comes to the light, so that it may be clearly seen that his works have been carried out in God. The Jewish leadership is putting burdens on people that not even God himself put on them. Jesus came to expose that kind of wickedness, and their sacred interpretation of the law was at stake, and even worse, their wickedness would be exposed. The Jewish leaders, they see the man and they ask him, who told you to do what you're doing? And the man answers, the man who healed me, that man said to me, take up your bed and walk. Would you look at the confidence in this guy? He met Jesus for what, maybe 5-10 minutes? And I find that this man in those few moments with Jesus learned more about him than my years of studying brought together, because this is what it produces. That kind of answer. He stands so firmly on God's command and God's word and says, take it up with him. He told me to do it. And I listened because, look, I'm standing. You couldn't do that for me. Why do we fear so much? Why do we fear so much the world taking the things from us that it never gave us in the first place? The things that God has given us, why do we fear that other people can come and steal them when he himself has said, nothing can separate you from my love. I'm giving you things that will not perish. I am with you to the end of the age. Verse 14, afterward Jesus found him in the temple. 2 more verses and then we're done. Verse 14, afterward Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, see, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you. Now we see a test and we see a new command. Where will you be found when God gives you the thing that you've been wanting? The good thing that you've been asking for, the thing that you've been praying about, the thing that you know that you needed. What happens when the blessing comes? Do you take his blessing and run because you've got the thing that you wanted? Or do we see the test of this man and find some encouragement that the man receives a healing on a day that he probably didn't think that he would? And the first thing he does is he goes to the temple and praises God because he knows only God could have given this to me. Not only that, though, Jesus speaks not just now to the man's legs, not just to his body, but he speaks to his soul. And he says, go and sin no more, lest nothing worse happen to you. Worse than 38 years of pain and mockery, worse than 38 years of ridicule, worse than 38 years of just sitting there, being cooked in the sun. What could be worse than that? I don't know, but if Jesus can speak planets into existence and they'll obey him, if Jesus can speak to broken limbs and they'll operate, and he can speak to the soul and says there's something worse out there, he's got a good enough track record for me to listen. Go and sin no more, he speaks to the man's conscience. Now, some commentators would say that it was the man's sin when he was younger that resulted in this disability in the first place. But Jesus doesn't lecture the man before he heals him. He doesn't walk up to him and says, I know what you did 38 years ago. I know what your life was like. See, some of us, we're afraid to come to Jesus because we think, God, you're not going to love me until you give me the heavy hand. And he will give you the heavy hand. He'll give it all to us. For all of us, we'll get it. But he sees his affliction and has compassion on him, sees him praising God and says, sir, friend, now that we've addressed your physical legs and you can walk on earth, I need to address your spiritual legs so that you can walk with God. Because think about it. Think about what people who walk with God do. They begin to hate sin. Walking with God inevitably means hating the sin which you once loved. And you might look at that and go and sin no more? How difficult is that? But then again, you're talking to the same guy that spoke to broken legs that did not work for 38 years, and he said, in an instant, walk. And they obeyed. When God gives a command, he gives us the strength to obey that command. It's not an easy thing to do, but the man had to walk and to take his steps. And same thing is what we have to do with the moral law. When God speaks to our conscience, convicts us of sin, and says, go and sin no more, lest worse things happen to us, we have to practice it. Because pretenders don't get far in the kingdom of God. And neither do the lazy. The strength to obey comes with the command. I'm going to ask the worship team to come. One of C.S. Lewis's prominent arguments for God's existence is that he would look at the world and he would say, this world is so cruel and unjust and broken, there could not be a God. And he became an atheist for a while. And one of the things that brought him back was, if just and unjust, if cruelty and goodness is all just in my head, then the argument collapses and I actually don't even have a reason to be upset at God because it just exists in my own head. There is a moral law that's out there that's outside of me. And if there's a law, then that means there needs to be a lawgiver. God's given us a moral law, but we've violated that moral law. That C.S. Lewis also looks at and says, but we go against our conscience all the time. We all experience fault. We all experience shame. We all experience guilt. And we might disagree on to what makes us feel guilty, but we all experience it. And he said that that's a universal feeling. But where did that come from? Where do we get this idea of feeling guilty? Where do we get shame in the first place? Well, it's the violation of something that is good, a violation of something that is right. And he goes, there's a law, there's a lawgiver, we are lawbreakers. What's next? And the story of Jesus captures him so well, where he sees that Jesus would come to be a law fulfiller and to forgive us. This is the last thing Jesus says. And this is the thing that gets him in trouble. Jesus answered them, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." This marks the beginning. When Jesus says, "My Father," he's actually claiming equality with God. He doesn't go with the usual "Our Father," assuming that we're all children of God, right? We could be sons of Abraham, and that would have been a fine thing. But when he says, "My Father," he's speaking in such intimate terms with God that they look at that and say, he's not talking about covenant sonship. He's not talking about physical sonship, national sonship. He's talking about divine sonship. He is claiming to be the Son of God, which would mean he's claiming to be the Messiah. There are people that say Jesus never claimed to be God. Not in those words. But when we understand the context, when we understand what Jesus is saying, this is a direct claim to his messiahship. And that's why the religious leaders look at him and they go, "We need to kill this guy. He is blaspheming about God, claiming equality with him." Jesus got in trouble for doing this. Up until this point in John's gospel, for the first 5 chapters, John is writing about Jesus in such a way, counting his interactions, recording them and going, the religious leaders didn't really know what to do with him. They were hesitant about him because they didn't know what the result of his actions would be. And then comes this moment where we actually see a turn happening in John's gospel from now to the rest of the story of Jesus' life. Hesitance from religious leadership would actually result in hostility, it would result in hatred, and it would result in persecution. This is the miracle that got Jesus in trouble, and that was the beginning of something. And so as good thinkers and as good philosophers, as good theologians, we ask ourselves, why did Jesus get himself in trouble? Was it accidental? Well, no, of course not. He didn't do anything accidentally. Okay, so Jesus gets himself in trouble on purpose. For his own sake? For his own glory? I think yes, but he didn't have to come to earth to do that. There could have been so many ways that he could have just had his glory intact and kept it and been fine. The Bible tells us that Jesus counted equality with God not something to be grasped for his own benefit, but emptied himself for us. So the answer to the question, why does Jesus go and get himself in trouble? He gets himself in trouble for you and for I. How do we know that? If you remember at the very beginning of the passage, it said that Jesus walked through the sheep's gate and made his way into the pool of Bethesda. Remember what the sheep gate represented? It was the place where animals would be prepared for sacrifice at the temple. And it's where the people of God would have their sins forgiven because something would die in their place. From this moment to the end of John's gospel, Jesus is preparing himself to be the spotless lamb that would be slain for the sins of his people. He walks through the very place that one day he would have to walk through again and take on the sins of all of humanity, die in our place so that we might be forgiven. Where does Jesus perform the miracle? At the pool of Bethesda, the place of mercy. In order to have mercy, in order to have forgiveness, somebody has to pay for it. Somebody has to give a cost. God was willing to die for you and to die for me so that we might obtain forgiveness and mercy from him. So why can we trust that he will give us the power to obey? Why can we believe that he is far greater than our pools of Bethesda? Why is he a much better place for our healing, for our deliverance, for our lives? It's because he was willing to die for you. He came to you when you weren't looking for him and was willing to die for you. He stood in between you and the thing you think you needed and was willing to die for you. He gives you the strength to resist and to kill sin. Why can we trust that? Because he was willing to die for you. This is why he is worthy of it all. This is why he is so deserving of our praise and why he is so amazing. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to invite you all to stand. We're going to end in song and we're going to end in celebration. I'm going to invite some of our altar counselors to come. The team's going to lead us in song and celebration and praise because he is so worthy. But I want to make a special invitation to some of you here. That let's say you were here tonight and you recognize, this really is what Jesus did for me. And there's something in you that is stirring and you go, I need to know more. I want to know more. I need prayer because I know what I've been looking at and it hasn't been Jesus. Help me to see who God is. Man, my hope and my prayer for you today is that you would see him, that in seeing him you would walk with him. In walking with him, you would give your life to him because he gave his life for you. And so if that's you, if you today have recognized, I need Christ in a way that I didn't know that I needed him before, I want to invite you to come forward as we sing this song.